Okay, so getting into Marvel Generations the Best, this is a really interesting story. And it's actually pretty cool, in terms of how it unfolds. Remember, for those of you guys who are new here, Marvel Generations is basically the story that Marvel is using to segue into the new branding initiative, in the sense that with, after the events of Secret Wars 2015, you had all new, all different Marvel. After all new, all different Marvel, you had Marvel Now 2.0. Then you had Secret Empire. Secret Empire, I would say, is probably part of Marvel Now 2.0, but because of the fact that a lot of the changes that Marvel was making were not very well received, what Marvel did is they followed up and said, okay, fine, we'll go back to basics. They were going to release a story called Marvel Legacy. Marvel Legacy is a one-shot, and all it's going to do is just give us all the mantles of the characters who have existed over the years. Avengers like 1 million or 1 billion or 10,000 BC or whatever it is, I don't remember the exact number, but it's basically going to tell us there's been a long line of these different iterations of heroes. Marvel Generations, these are basically just fill-in comics. They're just one-shots. They don't really pertain to anything in particular, at least they don't seem to. Instead, it's just kind of stories that give us the newer characters juxtaposed to the classic characters. But the idea here is that, like most of the Generation stories, the newer modern characters, in this case, all new, all different Wolverine X-23, is suddenly just thrown into the past with classic Wolverine. Now, to catch up people who are a little new here, who are basically stumbling across this, looking to get into Marvel for the first time, X-23 Laura Kinney is basically a clone of Wolverine. Now, originally, it was supposed to be a clone of Wolverine down to the T, which is to say a male clone, a guy walking around looking just like Wolverine. And this was basically done by this sort of rebooted version of Weapon X, I guess really created by a guy named Xander Rice, or at least not really created by him, but for the most part, the project's being run by him. But the idea is that, this newer version of Weapon X under Xander Rice looked to clone Wolverine and basically send him on a series of missions to the highest bidder. Whoever it was that paid the most money would have Wolverine carry out that mission. Again, it's a little bit of a change here with regards to her character, but on the whole, as she's been written over the years and as she's been depicted, whether it was in the X-Men Evolution animated series or it was in the actual comic itself, she's basically faster than Wolverine. She's a little more fluid in her movements than Wolverine is, whereas classic Wolverine's just like this guy who really knows how to fight well, and he knows all different kinds of martial arts, but he's really more of just like a slasher. He just goes in there and just starts slashing away at things, and that's really about it. But the fact remains here, when it comes to this particular story, Wolverine has fought the Hand on a multitude of occasions, but that's why I say this particular story goes back to 1984. And the reason why is because of X-23 showing up, and helping classic Wolverine fight alongside the Hand and then basically defeat the Hand, allowing one of them to leave so they could basically trace, where this guy's going to and find this girl, Amiko. The reason why this is important is because Amiko made her appearance after the events of Secret Wars, the original Secret Wars, back in 1984. Now, it involved this really weird story in Uncanny X-Men 181. I think it was The Young and the Dragon. I'm not 100% sure exactly what the title was, but it was basically this idea that like this dragon had essentially followed, come with the X-Men back to Earth after the events of Secret Wars. It went on this giant rampage and it killed the parents of Miko. And so in response, Logan basically adopted her as her own. The issue is that he couldn't really take care of her. And so what he ended up doing was giving her to his love interest at the time, a girl named Mariko. Now, what the story does is it fits in those two places, and it actually goes back and changes those things a bit. For the most part, it was basically believed that the idea was that with Wolverine being part of the X-Men, he just couldn't take care of Amiko. He could not be an X-Man and a parent at the same time. There was no room for that. He either had to devote his time to one or devote his time to the other. Now, in truth, he could have done both, but he would have done a shoddy job at both of them. And so the result was that he chose to give up Amiko and go back to his life of being an X-Man. Now, the way the story was written back in 1984 and 1985, because Chris Claremont was writing the X-Men at the time, it wasn't just like a throwaway thing. Chris Claremont was always about character development. That's the only thing that mattered, was developing characters. And so what he ended up doing was basically introducing this character as the possibility of Wolverine having a daughter, and then hand her over to Mariko, and then leave it. And then just wait and see how fans respond. And if fans respond positively, then bring Amigo back for a couple more issues, and then, have her go away again. And if fans respond to that, then bring her back again. And then eventually you begin the process of this slow, gradual building this character up, introducing this character, and then in turn, giving her a larger role within the X-Men universe. It's the same thing that Marvel did with X-23. X-23 had her origin story, she was on the scene, but she didn't replace Wolverine right off the bat. Instead, you got this slow slow build where she came to terms with her father. She fought Wolverine on a couple of occasions and beat the crap out of him the first time they fought. It was pretty cool. But it's an interesting scenario because Claremont was all about character development. And it's interesting because if you go and read his stories, and you watch his interviews, his argument is basically anybody can make a story where heroes fight each other. That's not hard. What's hard is creating characters that people care about, that they can relate to. That's the difficult thing. And so again, once they get back into this hand facility, having followed this guy, they're suddenly met by a surprise grenade. And then of course, some guy shows up and basically says, hey, look, we as the hand were duped. We were paid to kidnap this girl. We were not paid for what he's asking now. Now, when it comes to the hand in Marvel Comics, they are basically available to the highest bidder, but woe betide the poor soul who betrays the hand. And that's the way it works. You can go to them. You can go to this mystical Japanese ninja society and you can say, hey, look, I want to hire your services, and they'll charge you a lot of money. But if you can pay it, then they'll do whatever you want to. That's what makes the hand so dangerous. The hand are virtually untraceable and they're everywhere. I mean, they're all over the place. They're in governments, they're in businesses, they're in regular society. Half the time you could walk by a member of the hand and never know it. They are that clandestine. And if the hand are basically paid to commit an act, they'll do whatever it is they have to do in order to commit that act, whether it's eliminating, corporate rivals, whether it's eliminating politicians, whatever the case may be. If they are tasked with a goal, they will take it out. And what makes them so dangerous is no one knows how it happened. Some senator sitting in his office somewhere, and then there's a scuffle, and then somebody walks in, the senator's dead. There's no indication anybody was ever there. The windows are still locked, the vents aren't open. Nobody knows how it was the senator died. They're just gone. And it's one of those weird situations. It's kind of cool, and it's really intriguing with regards to the hand, but that's why you don't see them too often, because they're kind of this MacGuffin, kind of this, they'll solve all the world's problems, and it's kind of a funny situation. But ultimately, they end up tracking down where it is Amiko's being held, which of course is at an airport in Tokyo. When they arrive there, we end up finding out the person who engineered all of this is Sabretooth. Now, as far as I'm aware, and I'm going to go out on a limb here, as far as I'm aware, X-23 and Sabretooth have never really had like a true one-on-one fight. They've scuffled a few times before. I believe they actually encountered and scuffled during the events of Wolverines, but I do not believe they've had like a true one-on-one battle. And when I say like a true one-on-one battle, I'm talking about like the ferocity of the battles between like classic Wolverine and Sabretooth, because their fights were legendary. Man, those are stuff of legend. If you look up the fights between Sabretooth and Wolverine, they are absolutely amazing in terms of the two of them tearing each other apart. But the general gist of this idea is that both X-23 and classic Wolverine, of course, board the plane, only to realize that Sabretooth was the one who had basically kidnapped Amiko. Now, of course, this leads directly to X-23 facing off against Sabretooth, and the fight here is kind of interesting. For the most part, I'm going to go out on a limb and say that I do not believe under any normal circumstance that X-23 would actually defeat classic Sabretooth, this version of Sabretooth back from the 1980s. If it was the more modern version, probably, but with regards to like this classic version, most likely not, because the way he was written back then is he was devoid of any morality whatsoever. He was just this cruel, sadistic thing who was more of like an animal than an actual person and would basically tear apart anybody that he would come across. Now, the other half of this is that with X-23, she is extremely fast, and one of the only real reasons why she was able to take out classic Wolverine is because of the fact that she's not as heavy as he is, due to the fact that she does not have adamantium laced to her bones. She has adamantium laced to her claws, but she does not have an adamantium skeleton. And so because of this, it actually weighs down Wolverine. Now, his body's somewhat adapted to cope with that, but you're literally talking about just this giant force just swinging at things, whereas with X-23, she's fluid, she's quick, she's fast, all those little things that go into her training as a prodigious Black Ops agent. So again, it's sort of an interesting scenario. I'm kind of curious, who do you guys think would actually win in like a brutal, no holds barred, the landscape's empty, they're fighting out in the middle of the desert? Who do you think would win between like X-23 and classic Sabretooth? Because again, I kind of think it's classic Sabretooth here, but the overall gist is that X-23 knows who Sabretooth is, right? Like she's been around the process long enough to know. I mean, again, they had been side by side in Wolverines alongside like Mystique and so on and so forth. So she knows what Sabretooth is about. But again, as far as I'm aware, she never encountered classic Sabretooth, so she doesn't really know exactly how hardcore Sabretooth can be. Now, of course, with her offering somewhat of a distraction, ultimately this results in, Logan, or I guess classic Wolverine, showing up and then just kind of like, attacking attacking Sabretooth. Now, of course, X-23 uses this as a momentary distraction to basically incapacitate him. Again, remember, he has a healing factor, so being stabbed through the throat is not going to kill him. It'll just send him running, and then eventually he'll heal and he'll come back and do whatever it is that he does next. But with regards to him transferring Amiko over to Mariko, this again basically kind of wraps back around to the idea of what Chris Claremont did. That Wolverine basically takes this daughter, so to speak, and says, okay, look, Mariko, you have to watch over her. I don't have the ability to do this. Now, the biggest reason, and one of the coolest things about this, is this leads to a direct conflict between X-23 and classic Wolverine. Now, on the surface, it would be easy to look at this and just say, okay, well, it's, classic Wolverine, he's like, I can't be an X-Man and take care of a daughter at the same time, and X-23 is like, yes, you can. But remember, X-23 is basically the daughter of Logan. It's as close as he ever got to having a biological daughter, but having a biological child of his own outside of Dakin. Dakin, of course, was a whole nother kettle of beans when it came to a son's hatred for his dad. But the idea is that with X-23, she looks at this scenario and actually reflects on her own life. Because remember, it wasn't until she showed up at the Xavier Institute that Wolverine even knew she existed. I mean, she was basically taken from some DNA samples left behind when classic Wolverine originally escaped the Weapon X project. She was basically grown in isolation, or I guess raised in isolation after having been born. She was trained to be a prodigious assassin in isolation. She went on these Black Ops missions in isolation. She never really experienced the outside world beyond whatever mission she was assigned at the time. I mean, she met her aunt, and her cousin, different things like that, but that was about it. I mean, she didn't go out and meet teams of people and so on and so forth. It wasn't until basically, Xander Rice was killed, the entire facility was burned down, she accidentally ended up killing her mother, and that she basically took off into the world, that she began to explore and see what was out there. But one of the first people she came across was classic Wolverine. But even then, even encountering her, his stance was, hey, look, I mean, I guess you're like a clone of me, but you're not really a daughter. And he never really treats her like a daughter. Now, this is not because he doesn't view her that way, it's because Wolverine never really treats anybody like a child. I mean, he does to a degree with Kitty Pryde, but that's about the extent of it. Kitty Pryde was more like a father figure to her, because that's how his character was written at the time. And because it was so intrinsic, because they had a comic together, Wolverine and Kitty Pryde, because they had a story together, it was one of those lasting, father-daughter type relationships that Marvel just kind of kept going forever. After a while, they would, go off on their own adventures, but it was always an undercurrent. It was always the idea of, hey, look, I am a father figure for you, you are like a daughter to me, I view you that way, we confide in each other about all our problems and different things like that. For X-23, she never got that treatment. She shows up, Wolverine's just like, who in the world are you? Eventually he figures out what's going on with her, she joins X-Force, she fights alongside Wolverine for a little while, tries to figure out her place in the X-Men, and that's really about it. She never really had a proper upbringing. And so in her mind, where Wolverine is in this position where he has the ability to relate to this daughter that he has, and he's basically adopted, where he has the ability to relate to Amiko, and instead decides to turn tail and run back to the X-Men, she calls him basically a coward and says it's easier for you to just run away and be an X-Man. It's easier for you to just run away from all your problems and pretend like she doesn't exist than it is for you to actually be a father. And it's a great bonding moment because she misses classic Wolverine. Remember, he died. He's dead. He ended up being encased in adamantium, and that was the end of it. She never really had a chance to actually bond with him the way that a daughter would bond with her father. And so this presents a circumstance, at least for her, to say goodbye one last time, but for her to also pass on this little bit of a story and say, go spend time with your daughter. If you're not going to do it for yourself, at least do it for me, because I'd like to have some peace in knowing that there's at least somebody out there that you cared about. But it's also a little bit of living vicariously through Amiko, because if X-23 can go forward believing the classic Wolverine actually took care of this girl the way he was supposed to, then in Laura's mind, he's taking care of her. So it's really kind of a cool, little bit of a moment between these characters, and it's interesting to me. And that's one of the reasons why I like it, is because X-23 and classic Wolverine have this father-daughter dynamic, but it's like an estranged daughter and estranged father. They know who the other is, but they're like two ships passing in the night. They say, hey, what's up? And then that's it. That's really all there is to it. And so again, it's kind of a cool scenario, and it's one of the reasons why I think this is definitely one of the better Marvel Generation stories. But I'm curious, let me know what you guys think down in the comments. Did you guys like this? You guys are just like, don't care. I'm kind of curious what you all think. But anyway, if you guys are new here to Comics Explained, make sure you guys hit the sub button to become part of the Rob Corps. If you guys enjoyed this video, make sure you drop a like, and yeah, I will catch you all later. Peace.